Yes, this is a time of overflow, but how are you stewarding it? God is looking for us to be good managers of what remains. He took me to John 6, and it talks about how Jesus fed the 5,000, and there was something specific that stuck out to me. It was in verse 12. When they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost." The word lost here means to destroy or to render, to cause to become useless. In this time of overflow, we cannot get so caught up on being filled because of the scarcity mindset that we once had, to where we just had enough, to where we had the bare minimum, to where we were scraping the bottom of the barrel. And now that God is pouring out, now that God is giving us this abundance, giving us this overflow, we're so caught up on being filled for ourselves, not realizing that He wants us to store up the abundance. He wants us to store up what remains, because that abundance, that overflow is not just for us. God provides overflow for a reason. Are you stewarding it well, or are you causing it to become useless? Immediately after I got that revelation on John 6, he took me to the story of Joseph. And when I tell you this thing, this thing blew my mind, bro. So a little bit of background on that. Joseph basically told dreams to his brothers. They got jealous. They started beefing with him. They sold him into slavery. Then he went to Egypt. Then he went to Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife ended up being a hoe. Then he went to the prison because he got lied on. So then in the prison, he came across the butler and the baker. Then they had dreams. They're like, what's this mean? Joseph ended up interpreting their dreams. One got beheaded and one went back to being a cupbearer, the butler, right under Pharaoh. And Joseph was like, don't forget about me, please. Don't forget about me, please. And he's like, all right, bet, I got you. The dude forgot about him. And then after that, he's just living his best life. You know, here you go, Pharaoh. Here you go. Here you go. And then after that, the Pharaoh was like, oh man, I got this dream that I need interpreted. He's like, speaking of, there was somebody that I forgot about that's still in the prison. You might want to hear about him. You might want to hear about him. That's a whole word in and of itself, because you trying to rush out this prison, but the famine wasn't scheduled to hit the land yet. You're trying to operate in your timing. Joseph was trying to operate because of the uncomfortability of the process, but he didn't realize that the process had 2 more years to go. He was blaming it on the butler, but it was really God doing it in the timing that he had for him. Hold up, y'all. Hold up. I need to look this up real quick, because this was off the script. Off the script. Really quick, if we look at Psalms 105, it just shows God's intentionality and how he was over the entire thing. He was over the timing. He was over Joseph being sent to the prison. He was over everything this entire time. He called for a famine in the land of Canaan, cutting off its food supply. Then he sent someone to Egypt ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with fetters and placed his neck in an iron collar until the time came to fulfill his dreams. The Lord tested Joseph's character. Until the time came to fulfill his dreams, the Lord tested Joseph's character. What if the reason he had to wait longer in this process is because his character had to be refined? Yes, the famine was going to come. Yes, the nations were going to be drawn. Yes, his brothers would bow before him. But in order for his brothers to bow before him, he had to make sure that he wasn't bitter. He had to make sure that he wasn't in a position to curse them with this power that he had from God, because he could have refused his brothers the food. If he was bitter, he could have just shooed them away in unforgiveness out of bitterness. But God is making sure that some of us, this was not on my notes, God was making sure that some of us have the proper character to receive the leadership positions that he is calling us into. We need to make sure in this time, we need to make sure in this time that we are stewarding our character well as the overflow. The gifts will make room for us. They will bring us before the Pharaoh. They will bring us before the important people, but it is your character that keeps you there. The gifts are the avenue for you to get to the promise, for you to get to the palace, but it is your character that keeps you there. It is your character that maintains you in those positions of leadership, in those positions of overflow. He had the gift all along, but in order for it to not only evolve, but for his character to evolve as well, he had to go through this 13-year process. Some of us are so caught up in the time it takes for God's promises to come to pass that we look so much at the promise that we don't look at ourselves. We don't look at the character that God is trying to develop. It's cultivation. Jesus. Anyway. So then Joseph gets promoted, interprets these dreams. In the dreams, there's 7 years of prosperity. There's 7 years of prosperity, and then there's 7 years of famine. So Joseph gets put in charge of the years in prosperity as well as the years in famine. So we get to see here how Joseph stewarded the overflow. So let's start in verse 45. I'm gonna just skip around a little bit. Verse 45. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name So let's look at what actually means. So it means treasury of the glorious rest. Let's look at what each word means. Treasury means a bank or someone who manages finances or funds. So glorious means that something is worthy to receive glory, fame, or admiration. And rest, at first, I thought that God was trying to show me the definition where it's like you're relaxing, you're chilling, you just laying back. But he took me to the definition where it says the remaining part of something, the fragments, the remaining part of something. So Joseph became the bank or the manager of the remaining food that brought fame to the land. The overflow was not needed until the famine. He is calling for us to store it up in this time because we're already filled. We're already filled. So that just shows that the overflow is not for us. It's for the nations that will be drawn to us. So now let's look at verse 47. Now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities, and he laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. And then skipping down to verse 53. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended. And the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. The famine was in all the land, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. Oof, there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to, you do." Oh, no. Whatever he says to you, do. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. This overflow brought fame to the land so that the entire world, which consists of various nations, would be drawn to this excess amount. The overflow was immeasurable for a reason. It wasn't just for Egypt. It was for all the nations to partake in. We cannot be selfish in this time. We have to rebuke the spirit of gluttony. In this abundance, we run the risk of trying to overconsume, thinking that all of this is for ourselves, but we can't be greedy. This is not for us to be greedy. When we are filled, we need to store this up for the nations that are called to us. Yes, in this time, we don't see the nations. We don't see the world. We don't see the entire plot or plan of what God is doing. But that is why, while we are getting this overflow, we need to store it up. Because when the nations come during famine, we need to make sure that we are in place to give to them. If the people were trying to overeat and take up more than they needed, they wouldn't have had any left over for the famine, not just for themselves, but for the nations that were assigned to them. This is not about us. This is not about us. This is not about us. This is about the nations that are assigned to us. It was never about us. If we're going to be real, the glory isn't just for us to have pride from this glorious rest, the glorious remaining. It's not for us to have pride, but it's for the nations to be drawn to the God who provided us with this overflow. If you look very closely at verse 54, it says, "And the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. The famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread." If you look closely back at the story of him feeding the 5,000, there is another story that follows directly after that, when people were following him asking for more of this natural bread. But Jesus was like, no, I didn't just come for you to be filled in the natural. I came for you to be filled in the spiritual, because he is the bread of life. Man shall not live on bread alone, but out of every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. So yes, he is drawing the nations in. He is drawing them in with the natural supply, with the natural materials, with the natural abundance that the saints of God, that the kingdom people are receiving in this time. And while they have been drawn in by this natural bread, he is more concerned with being the bread of life to them. He is more concerned with us dispersing to them and allowing them to see the bread of life that we have in God. The natural, okay, yeah. And like, we're getting abundance, we're getting the financial, we're getting the, all this different type of stuff. Our businesses are thriving, debt free, all this all this stuff is amazing, but it don't mean nothing if we don't give the people God. It doesn't mean anything if we don't give the people God. Jesus, I'm about to give y'all another Bible study on Esther, because that really ties into it. But a summary on that is, Esther was put into this position to be under the king, but it wasn't for her. It was so that Mordecai's name could be great, not hers. If you look at chapter 10, it don't mention anything about Esther. It mentions Mordecai. So Esther prepared the way for Mordecai's name to be great. Just how we in this time are preparing the way for God's name to be great through the works that he is doing through us, through the overflow that he is providing through us. It was never about you. Sad to say, but we need to get over it, for real. We're going to be blessed. We're going to be provided for, but this was all so that God could get the glory, because God came so that we can have life and life more abundantly. So get used to the abundance. But understand that that abundance is not just for you. Sweet pea. Amen. But that's all I gotta say.